Many people have said this is genocide. Justice Sinclair has said it's genocide. The former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada has called it genocide. So how do we investigate that? What are the patterns that we see from residential school to residential school in relation to the deaths of the children? And who do we hold accountable for that?
That's Kimberly Murray, Canada's first Independent Special Interlocutor for unmarked graves and burial sites associated with former residential schools. We're very pleased to have her as our guest on Explore, a Canadian Geographic podcast. Welcome to all you explorers out there, armchair and in motion. I'm David McGuffin. So it was 4 degrees Celsius in my little corner of the woods this morning in West Quebec. Fall is making its presence felt. There's a kind of beautiful sadness to the arrival of fall, underlying sadness. It's definitely a season of reflection, and that's really become even more true in the last couple of years. For now, here in Canada on September 30th, we mark September 30th as the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. It's a day when we reflect on and remember those tens of thousands of Indigenous children, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, who were ripped away from their families and forced to go to residential school with the express purpose of really wiping out their culture, their languages. And we now know that there was horrendous abuses that went on for well over a century at these residential schools. Thousands upon thousands of children died there, often of abuse, disease, hunger. So we remember them on this September 30th, and we look to heal the wounds, the intergenerational trauma that's happened coming out of that. Our guest today, Kimberly Murray, for 5 years was the executive director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And more recently, she led the search for unmarked graves at the Six Nations of Grand River, working to recover the missing children and unmarked burials at the Mohawk Institute, the oldest residential school in Canada. And now, as I mentioned, she is the special interlocutor for unmarked graves and burial sites right across Canada, a job that she took over in mid-June. And we're very lucky to have her here as our guest. Kimberly Murray, welcome to the Explore podcast.
Thank you.
Congratulations on your new position. It's quite an impressive title. It's a mouthful, but obviously it also covers a lot of important topics and ground. What does your job allow you to do, and what are you hoping to achieve with this, which I know is a big question?
I mean, first, I just want to go back to how you said it's an impressive title. The problem with my title is most people don't know what it is, what it means, right? So, the term interlocutor is not a commonly known term, especially among First Nations, Inuit, Métis people. And that's the number one question I get is, what's an interlocutor? And, some people have said is it an interloper? And it's interesting. So, when you look up at the definition of an interlocutor, it's someone that talks. And, of course, I get that question too. Well, we need more than talk, right? We need action to address the issues of the unmarked burials and the missing children. So, the main role of my position is to have those conversations and have dialogue with First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, survivors, and leadership around the important work of recovery of the children and how I can help facilitate to remove some of the barriers that they're facing. And so, so it is a big role of talking but more importantly, listening, listening to communities, listening to the challenges that they've been facing, not just in the last year since to Kamloops, but for decades in trying to recover the children that went missing at Indian residential schools.
You mentioned Kamloops, and that is just over a year ago now, and Cowessess First Nation obviously as well. And I know there's been a big effort now across the country to find these unmarked graves. I mean, where are we with that?
Yeah, I think first, I think that to Kamloops, when they announced the recovery of the 215 potential burials of children, it really sort of put the spotlight on the concerns that survivors and communities have been raising for decades. I think it's really important for Canadians to understand that there have been recoveries prior to Kamloops of burials on former grounds of Indian residential schools
Mm-hmm.
and industrial schools. There was a situation in Dunbow, Alberta, where the remains of children came up when the river flooded on the grounds of the old residential school there, and those remains had to be repatriated and reburied. There's example in Regina with the Red Deer Industrial School. There's a whole cemetery of burials. Survivors and communities have known this, that there are children buried all over the country that were forced to attend Indian residential schools and the Indian hospitals and other institutions. To Kamloops, when it happened and it was announced, it really sort of grabbed the attention, the heart, and of Canadians and the world, and really ignited a more fulsome response from Canada and the governments. And so when you say, where are we at? Canada made some announcements. One of the first announcements they made was to create the special interlocutor position to assist communities. And then they've also committed a number of other resources to the community, to communities to do the work. And so my understanding, there's approximately 80 communities right now have started to do the work of recovery that are being supported with funding from Canada. And everybody's at a different place in their recovery work. Some are just starting the research. Others are way along and have done the GPR such as to Kamloops, and they're having those difficult conversations now about whether they repatriate the remains.
And you mentioned, this position that you're in now is it was an appointment by the Department of Justice, and it's an independent position, independent role, but it is within the Department of Justice. And I guess the question is justice. I mean, where does justice come from? And I had Connie Walker on the podcast a couple months ago, and we had a long conversation about the lack of justice, even post TRC. And so, what are you hoping on that front?
Yeah, it's a really important question. What does justice look like, and what does it mean for survivors and communities that have missing children and unmarked burials in their territories? One part of the justice is, that we have no laws, right? We have no laws to protect these grounds. We have no laws to support communities in accessing the grounds that potentially are privately owned now. Part of my job is to make recommendations to Canada on a new federal framework, on a legal framework on how we can protect, preserve, commemorate these grounds. But, broader than that, what does justice mean? I mean, nobody's been charged with murder. Nobody's been charged with negligence of these children, criminally charged. And so I've been hearing that in my first 2 months of my position and speaking to survivors and communities. They're asking that question. What about justice? How do we hold Canada to account? How do we hold the churches to account? Because they haven't thus far really been held accountable. And, part of the work that I'll be doing is really thinking about what does that look like, and how can we achieve justice? And people need to understand investigating genocide is very different than investigating a criminal code crime. And early on in my thinking, we do not have the expertise right now to investigate genocide in our country. And so is there things we can learn internationally about how we investigate the crime of genocide? Many people have said this is genocide. Justice Sinclair has said it's genocide. The former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada has called it genocide. So how do we investigate that? What are the patterns that we see from residential school to residential school in relation to the deaths of the children? And who do we hold accountable for that?
Right. I mean, it seems at a fundamental level, it just should be police investigations as they would carry out almost any investigation, no? I mean, if there's
Uh,
dead bodies and questionable deaths.
well, this is what I mean by the police services don't have the expertise to do this investigation, and meaning no disrespect to the officers on the ground. But first of all, there's a question of trust. We know that the RCMP were heavily involved in the residential school system. They were the ones that apprehended the children and took them to the institutes. They were the ones that were hired to return the kids when they ran away from them. And they were the ones that did the failed investigations when parents came forward while they were operating, saying bad things are happening in the school. You know, we have a number of failed police investigations and failed prosecutions. And it's not just the RCMP, it's the Ontario Provincial Police, it's the Quebec Provincial Police, it's the former British Columbia Provincial Police,
Mm-hmm.
and then we have our municipal police services. Many of them were involved. You know, I have seen records where the Toronto Police Service were involved in taking kids back to the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario. So, you know, the idea that we're going to ask a police service, an institution that was involved in protecting these institutions for so many decades, why would we trust them now to
Mm-hmm.
do the proper work? But that aside, I also think that the way our criminal justice system works, we know report after report after report have said that it has failed Indigenous people. And so why would we turn to this justice system that has failed us day in and day out? And is there a better system? And the thing about my mandate, it talks about and directs me to look at Indigenous law and how we can incorporate Indigenous law into the solutions. And so, what would it look like? You
Yeah.
know, what would it look like if we had a special police task force, a special police service made up of
Mm-hmm.
Indigenous officers trained, maybe bringing in an international expertise to assist? Is that
Mm-hmm.
in the realm of possibility for us? Would that have more trust from survivors and communities?
I mean, you talk about genocide too, and internationally, Canada has a pretty robust track record of investigating. I'm thinking of Louise Arbour. I was in Darfur. There were Canadian police officers there investigating. I mean, it seems it's definitely within our abilities as a nation, you know. And how do you then get that to pivot to look at something possibly more difficult because it is within Canada? But how do you get that pivot to happen?
Well, I mean, that's the thing, right? The expertise that you talk about internationally, we've never investigated ourselves for genocide. And so, you know, what would that look like? What needs to
Mm-hmm.
change? We can keep having conversations with people. I think that there's this denial
Mm-hmm.
still among many Canadians within government, outside of government, about, well, these kids just all died of
Yeah.
disease,
Right.
right? Like we all were dying of disease during the times, and this is
Mm-hmm.
no different. But if you were to read, and I encourage everybody to read Volume 4 of the Truth and Reconciliation Report, which is
Right.
specific to missing children, when you read that and you see the rate of death was exceedingly higher for Indigenous children in residential schools than anywhere else in the
Mm-hmm.
country. We forced these children to be in these institutes, and then we underfunded them
Yeah.
and created the scenario where high disease was prevalent, which caused them to die. We also didn't take them to get proper medical care. We also didn't have doctors and physicians and nurses inside those institutions to care for them. And then when we did send them to hospitals, we sent them to underfunded Indian hospitals, which were just as bad as the Indian residential schools. So, you know, there's a lot more
Yeah.
that was happening. And there's some testimony too that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission gathered from survivors where they speak about seeing murders. They see about people being beat to death. And so that's a very important question for communities when it comes to exhumation. There are those questions. How did these children die? Was it disease, or was there wrongdoing in the nature of murder? And when you hear the testimony, you hear the stories that came that have come forward from the 7,000 survivors that testified, that's a big question that communities still have.
I mean, the one thing it always struck me is when you look at the plans and designs for residential schools, they all mostly included graveyards, but didn't include playgrounds. What does that tell you? And I mean, I certainly never went to an elementary school with a graveyard in it. There was a knowledge from the get-go that this was going to be an issue, it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely. And then pair that with the policies of the government at the time, where they right out refuse to pay to return children home. So we know that children are buried somewhere and not in their home communities, because Canada refused to pay for the transportation of the remains back to where they came from.
Right.
And some of these, you talk about the blueprints or the plans for the residential schools. Some of them had rifle ranges. Like the Mohawk Institute down in Brantford had a rifle range, had 2 rifle ranges. What school has a rifle range? And, there are stories from the survivors that were handed down from, generation to generation of the kids being at that school, that there are burials at the rifle range, that there was a time when kids were lined up and shot, and whether those are, those rumors, that's what we have to quell those rumors, right? We have to confirm or get the evidence to put a stop to them, because we'll continue to have this conversation for generations if we don't do the work today. It'll be my grandchildren will be having those same conversations if we don't do the work today.
No, exactly. And you mentioned the Mohawk Institute, and just prior to this, you were involved in searching for graves and doing underground radar sort of searches. And I'm just wondering what came of that, and what that experience is, how that has prepared you for this.
I'll leave it to the survivor secretary to update you on where things are at with their search. But the survivors started the ground penetrating radar search. They purchased 3 machines. There's over 600 acres of land to search. They have multiple teams that have been trained. And what's quite unique about that situation down at the Mohawk Institute is that Six Nations has been training their own people to operate the machine. So they're not relying on outside companies to come in. So it's really community led and involved. And so those searches continue to happen. There's a massive, and this is, I'm learning very quickly in my role, and I kind of got I learned about it working at the Survivor Secretariat and the Mohawk Institute, is there's this massive backlog we're having right now in analyzing data. There's just so few people that have the expertise to analyze the data. It's a lot easier to collect it once you know how to operate the machine and what to set your antenna at, and in relation to the different types of soil on the property. But then what? Once you have to process that data, and then it has to be line by line reviewed by experts that know how to look for burials. There are a lot of companies out there that use GPR to find pipes and cement blocks under the ground where old foundations, they have great expertise in finding those, because they scream at you when you look at the data. They're really impossible to miss in many cases. They simply do not have the expertise to identify a grave shaft. And the thing about ground penetrating radar is they're not picking, you don't see bodies, right? You just see disturbances in the earth, and you have to know what that could potentially look like for a burial, for a grave shaft. And there's probably, we can count on one hand in Canada, expertise in that area. And so there is a real need to expand our expertise in that, because there's just going to be a mass, I mean, there already is a backlog of people in the queue waiting to get their data analyzed.
What makes this position you're in now different than what the TRC did several years ago?
Oh boy, I've never been asked that question. What makes it different? It's different in that it's a focused truth gathering in the sense of it is very focused on the missing children and unmarked burials. Originally, missing children and unmarked burial question was not part of the Truth and Reconciliations Commission mandate. There was a whole committee that was operating when the TRC was established that was answering those questions: who died, where they died, how they died, and where they're buried. And that somehow merged and got transferred over to us at the TRC very late in our mandate. And we had asked Canada for additional resources to do the work because we knew it was such a big question, and it was going to require on the ground going to those sites of the 41 residential schools to see if there's potential burials. That funding was denied by Canada, and so we did what we could as a commission to start the conversation, start answering those questions that survivors had asked and wanted answered. And so that's where you see the registry of children's names that died, which is on the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation's website. There's 3,200 names. Those are all deaths where there's documents that identify that they died. And I always like to remind people the records that the TRC had and worked with only came from Canada and the church entities that were part of the settlement agreement, and only came from the church entities that complied with the settlement agreement. And there's lots of problems with a number of the entities not complying. So when it comes to death and death investigations, a lot of the type of records that could connect information to a child and a death of a child are in the hands of provincial governments, are in the hands of municipal governments that issued permits for burials, that issued death certificates. And so those names, 3,200, were the names that the TRC were able to identify through the records it had received under the settlement agreement and that we were able to get through. And the document collection processes continued after the TRC, and much more work needs to be done in that regard. So just you had asked me that question about the difference. I do see my role as a continuation of the work that the TRC started. Calls to action 71 through 76, which are specifically address missing children and unmarked burials, called on institutions to continue the work, to look for the records, to provide the records to the National Center, to work with communities on finding the burials, and to work with communities on if they decide on repatriation of remains. And so nothing happened. The TRC ended in 2015. Here we are, 2022. Very little work was done on those calls to action in the 7 years. And so, it's like I'm picking up where I left off, I guess, in 2015 with more people also standing with us to get the work done now more than before.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time reporting from Africa, and like a lot of people, I followed the TRC in South Africa and what they were able to do, and was lucky to meet Desmond Tutu at one point. But what always struck me about that was they had teeth to prosecute. They had teeth to give immunity to people who did give testimony. They had a whole bunch of things. And it sounds like, what you're talking about, maybe getting some sort of special commission to look into genocide or something. Is that really at the root of what you want? Like we need something with teeth to actually dig into this at this point?
It's interesting. The TRC was always compared to South Africa's TRC, and there are a number of differences, and the main one being that in Canada it's a settlement agreement. Right? It was a negotiated settlement agreement. And so what the commissioners could and could not do was an agreement that all the parties came to. And so that teeth that they had in South Africa, the commissioners did not have in Canada. And it really was, under the settlement agreement, the TRC really was, the purpose was so that survivors' uh, experiences could be shared with Canadians to educate them, because all the other components of the settlement agreement were private and behind closed doors. And so there was no mechanism for people like you and others to hear what happened. And so there wasn't that ability to summons records, to summons people to testify. There was no immunity to those that would. And so what we ended up seeing, very few people that worked in the residential schools came forward to speak to the TRC. We did do a project where we worked with the churches to speak to former employees, and they wouldn't give us their names. They wouldn't give us any information to contact them directly. The churches all decided that they would write a letter on our behalf of the TRC saying, will you come speak to someone at the TRC about your experience? And inevitably, everyone that did come forward, the very small few that came forward, all said the same thing. I didn't know this was happening. If I had known, I would have stopped it. Yeah. Which doesn't match up when we look at the testimony of the survivors, when we look at the records of where that person worked, and maybe you didn't know, but it clearly was happening right under your nose. I've forgotten your question now.
No, just comparing and just eventually getting to a point where there is a body in Canada that has teeth to actually bring justice ultimately.
Yes. And you are aware that, there is a call for a special prosecutor. And so, who would that, when I say who, I don't mean the individual, but what would be the entity that would be the special prosecutor? Who has the power to lay charges? Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's police services in Canada. There is a complaint that's been filed with the International Criminal Court, mm-hmm. Which doesn't look, from what I'm seeing, very promising to happen because of the way the court works. I am planning on speaking with individuals that have worked at the International Criminal Court to sort of get a better understanding of the court process and what needs to happen. So those are some of the questions that we're exploring as the Office of the Interlocutor to write about. But it's definitely a question that survivors are asking. Will there be criminal charges?
Yeah. I just want to touch on the Pope's visit. Pope Francis was obviously just here, and a big part of that was reconciliation, and there were certainly mixed reviews on how that turned out. I'm just wondering what you thought about his trip. And the other thing I'm really interested too, and does this open up access to Catholic Church records anymore post that visit?
I guess that's we'll see.
Yeah.
But just, when the, first of all, the Pope's visit is personal, right, to individual mm-hmm. survivors. I've heard from survivors that were in attendance that have said it was very meaningful to them, mm-hmm. that they really appreciated it and it was meaningful to them. And then, of course, we've heard from survivors that said, I don't need any more words of regret. I need action. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has a whole chapter on apologies that I encourage people to read in the mm-hmm. reconciliation volume. And it actually explores and looks at all the different apologies that have been made around the world to Indigenous people and who they came from, what the words delivered, and really looked at, what is a meaningful apology? What could it look like? And putting aside, that it's meaningful to the individual, whatever has meaning to them. But overall, there has to be some action attached to it, right? Mm-hmm. And when we look at Canada's apology that Prime Minister Harper issued, there was no action attached to it. None. There is none like, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to do it in the next 5 years or the next 10 years. There were no goalposts set for them to achieve. The same thing with the Pope's apology, right? There is no, okay, what are you going to do next from the apology? And so maybe, the academic thinker in me is like, Well, one, I was like, did your staff not read the TRC chapter on apologies and what we meant when the commissioner said the Pope should issue an apology? And so that was missing. Will it get us more records? I don't know. We had the same issue with the Anglican Church when the Archbishop of Canterbury visited Canada. The Anglican Church in Canada said that they provided all their records to the TRC. We've since learned it wasn't accurate. There were actually records that were not provided. We know that there's records in the New England Company in London, and we know that the Church of England holds records. And so there was a call on the primate of the Anglican Church and the Archbishop to get those records back to Canada for survivors doing recovery work in the Anglican schools. And so we wait. Right? We wait. And that's part of my job and our office is to make those inquiries of those bodies and those entities and to stand with the leadership in Canada to make sure that those records are delivered to the rightful, in the right hands. This is actually a really important conversation that we're having as a community is Indigenous data sovereignty. And what does that mean? And what does it look like? And who gets to hold these records and provide access to these records? Because we have all these institutions and people and churches and governments writing about our people. And then hiding the records from us and not allowing us to see them, collect them, correct them when they're not accurate. And so Indigenous data sovereignty is going to be a big part of the final report that I'm required to issue in 2 years.
So, I mean, obviously to collect all the information you're going to be collecting, you're going to be visiting a lot of communities over the next 2 years. Is that part of the plan?
Yeah. So we're hoping to hold a number of gatherings over the next 2 years. And the first one's in Edmonton, September 12th to 14th. Okay. And some of the gatherings that we're planning are specific to topics. Mm-hmm. That we want to cover. We'll be holding one in January in Vancouver on access to privacy, access to records and privacy legislation, and the issue of Indigenous data sovereignty, because we're hearing so much from communities that they can't get the records. They can't get at LA Library and Archives Canada. They can't get access to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation records. They can't get the church records. And those records are vitally important to identifying, first, every child that went to the residential school. We don't have that right now. We don't know every child that was forced to attend the school. And so how are we going to identify who those children are if we don't even know they were there? So communities need to sort of create those names of kids that were taken to the institutes. And then we're hoping to hold a gathering on Indigenous law to bring the elders and knowledge keepers together to talk about what are Indigenous laws in relation to burials and commemoration and preserving grounds where children are buried.
What would an example of that be, just for people who don't know much about Indigenous law?
Well, I mean, we're multiple nations,
yeah,
right?
Of course, yeah.
And every nation has its own laws and protocols around burial rights. Every community is going to have a different thought on whether we should disturb these burials. Should excavation happen? What does repatriation mean? There are ways to repatriate without actually repatriating bones. Right, we can repatriate. The ceremonies. I mean, this is, I think, what's most painful to communities is that these little ones were buried without the proper ceremonies for their spirits according to their cultural practices. And so, for some, it's we need to find where they are and do those ceremonies at that location. And then for others, it's like, no, we have to return them home to Mother Earth of their territory. I often, when I'm speaking to people, talk about what some elders have said, that ceremonies have been happening on some of these grounds for decades since they closed.
Mm.
The school's closed. But yet something more needs to be done because the children are still speaking to us. Their spirits are still there. People can feel them. There are still things that the children are doing to be noticed. Many have said what happened into Kamloops is the children speaking up
Yeah.
that you need to do more. That so now we have some of the knowledge keepers saying, maybe these ceremonies, there's more that we need to do. What is it that we need to do? And so bringing people together to have that conversation. And because kids were brought from all over to one location, right? Like I think into Kamloops, it's over 50 communities had their children taken to the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Mohawk Institute, it's over 30. And so you have Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and, Métis and Inuit kids all potentially buried on these grounds. What does that mean? They all have their own customs and Indigenous protocols in relation to burials, and they might conflict, right? They might conflict with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that happens, what's the solution? And I know that Indigenous law has mechanisms to resolve the conflict in our own ways. We had conflict long before settlers came here,
Right.
and we had ways to resolve those conflicts. And so what are the protocols we need to follow when the Indigenous customs aren't similar, aren't the same? And how do we address that? So that will be that gathering, which will be a really important conversation for communities. And they're having those conversations now internally and with the communities that have the children that were taken to the sites that they're responsible for.
I just wanted to ask about your own experience. We talk a lot about intergenerational damage when we talk about residential schools, and I'm wondering what your own family experience was and to what extent that has sort of led you to where you are today.
Well, so I'm Mohawk and a member of Ganasatage, which is Mohawk community, Lake of Two Mountains, and
Mm-hmm.
outside Montreal. And, unfortunately, mostly known as Oka.
Yeah.
And my grandfather was actually taken by the Jesuits. He wasn't taken to an Indian residential school, but he was taken to an orphanage. And very similar experience in that regard with abuses. And my partner, who's now deceased, his father is a residential school survivor from Shingwak, speaks of his experience running away. It's actually quite a story, but it's his story to share. Yeah, so I can remember my first time at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when I was hired as the executive director. The first time a church official walked in the room in their robes, wearing the black robes full all the way down to the ground with the big cross in front, and just this feeling of, I don't even know how to describe it, just this feeling of shock, fear, kind of a sickness in my stomach. And it was coming from what I knew about what happened to my grandfather. But, I think over the 5 years of working with the TRC, I learned to get beyond the rope and actually have the conversations with the individuals wearing them. And so, but it took me back. And I can remember being at one of our gatherings at the TRC where there were, a whole group of men that walked in their robes, walking around the room. And it was scary, actually, seeing them. It actually scared me. And I can't imagine, right, what survivors feel when they see that.
Or a 6-year-old, right?
Or a 6-year-old, right? Like the living survivors and children at the time. Yeah, so does that fuel me? Yes, it obviously fuels me. And then my previous work as a lawyer working at Aboriginal Legal Service in Toronto, I represented many, 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 many survivors seeking compensation for the harms done to them. And just, their experiences and their voices are in my head I live with the trust that they gave me in sharing that with me. So obviously feel a deep obligation to them to try and get that justice for them.
Mm-hmm. How do you protect yourself hearing all these stories?
Oh, well, you can't see this because it's a podcast, but I carry my medicine.
Yeah, for sure.
I carry my medicine. We have our ways. It's really important when we go to the sites to make sure we don't carry those spirits home with us. And so there are ceremonies that we do for that. I've actually been told by elders in the past that I carry extra spirits, and there's ceremonies for that. In our own Haudenosaunee traditions, we also have condolence ceremonies that we do, and so it's just really important. Stay grounded in who you are, and just know that I like to think we're on the right side of history doing this work, and we're doing it because it's the right thing to do, and I think most Canadians think it's the right thing to do. And that's who I feel that I need to spend my time with, are the Canadians that know it's the right thing to do, and not worry as much about the deniers that are out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think with your work, both with the TRC and probably now it's with this as well. I mean, I think the numbers of people who understand what went wrong is definitely grown, and I think in the last decade at least.
Absolutely. And I was reflecting on that actually, because I got asked that question last year. What's different? Because when the TRC was operating, we talked about the missing kids. We talked about the 3,200 deaths that we had identified. And
Mm-hmm.
at that time, there was lots of media attention. We did it twice in the 5 years, actually. I remember doing 2 rounds of media around that. And I get asked that question, what's different now? And I think that it's one thing for us to just report the numbers and to say that we identified this many deaths. I think that image of the flags on the ground really moved Canadians from their sort of head to their heart.
Mm-hmm.
And the commissioners always talked about that. How do we move Canadians from their head to their heart? Because we need that for reconciliation. And I think that happens with Kamloops. The other thing is, I like to think that the work of the TRC at our 7 national events, when we did Education Day, we would bring thousands of children to our events and teach them about Indian residential schools. And, young kids that were, in grade 8, 9, we have video of them, where they say, it's the worst thing Canada ever did. Mm-hmm. Biggest human rights abuse Canada ever did. Mm-hmm. They get it.
Yeah.
And here we are. They're young adults now, right? There are citizens that are in colleges and universities and entering leadership. And I like to think that they're far more well-informed than previous Canadians, because we never taught this in school.
No, at all. No.
No one was taught this in school.
No, absolutely not. I've kept you a long time, but I have one last question that's going to shift gears a little bit here too. It's when I ask all my guests, and it's, can you describe your favorite place spot in Canada?
Oh, wow. I've been all over Canada.
Yeah. It could be like a happy place, a place you go to in your mind when you need to get away from everything you're doing.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting that you asked that question, because there's lots of places I love. But I have a cabin on Georgina Island First Nation, which is on Lake Simcoe. Nice. You can't get to it unless you get on the ferry or take a boat. And it's a little cabin that my partner and I purchased many years ago, I guess 24 years ago. And unfortunately, he did drown in that lake, but it is still our happy place to go there.
Yeah. I mean, can you describe is it pine forest, or how does it look?
How does it look? Well,
yeah.
There's no neighbors.
It's a good starting point.
I have no neighbors. It's kind of an A-frame cabin. Lots of ground for the kids to run around in. I mean, they're adults now, so hopefully one day my grandchildren will be running around those lands. Very, it's interesting. We chose that location and that cabin because the water is shallow where you walk out to. So it was good for the kids when they were growing up. You didn't have to worry about deep waters. And it's just beautiful sunrises and sunsets. And, if only I could keep the jet skis away.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah. I think a lot of people are with you on that one. The next mission.
But definitely, I'd rather listen to the frogs and the crickets falling asleep than the traffic outside my house in Toronto.
Yeah, nice. Well, it's nice. And it's wonderful you still have those feelings, and I'm sorry for your loss there, but it's wonderful that those feelings are still there.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Kimberly Murray, thank you so much for coming on the Explore podcast. This has been a real pleasure. May not be the word I'm looking for, but I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, anytime, David. It was really nice talking with you. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and this podcast, can you do us a big favor and give us a really glowing review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen? I know that sounds like a bold ask, but the way the algorithm works in podcasting, it's the single best way to ensure these interviews reach as wide an audience as possible. So thank you very much. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. We'll be back again in 2 weeks. Until then, when we'll explore again, I'm David McGuffin.
I think right now we're enjoying very much looking back at the Earth, and it's just a fantastic experience, and I just can't wait to get back and start telling people.
We left Simpson about June the 10th with the Fur Brigade, consisting of a number of yacht boats, each manned by 10 voyageurs.
For us Inuit, it means that Inuit oral history is very strong.
And we flew low over every inch of the country that could be. We were hoping that he would fire at us.
I guess 160